Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at today's event. My name is Nisha. I am the chair of Desis for Progress. I wanted to take just a moment and welcome you all before I go ahead and pass it off to Joy to get us started today. We are very, very excited to have Vivek Bald with us today in conversation about his book, Bengali Harlem, and the Lost Histories of South Asian America. A couple of just quick welcome reminders. Again, thank you so much to Vivek for joining us. We will be recording this session, and so for those that have missed it, or if you're hopping in late or have to bounce early, you can certainly check it out on our YouTube channel after the event is over. Please make sure to follow along with us and follow us on social media. Our hashtag is WeAreDFP, and would love to have you following along the conversation there. A couple of other just housekeeping notes. If you have questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A box on your screen through Zoom, and we'll have Q&A after the presentation is completed. With that, I will certainly sit back and get ready to enjoy this presentation. But for all of you, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Joy Dar. She is a board member of Desis for Progress and our events chair, and she will introduce Vivek and get you all on your way to the event. Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you again, Vivek, for joining us, and thank you, Nisha, for opening. So I'll start with introing Vivek. Vivek is a scholar, writer, and documentary filmmaker whose work focuses on histories of migration and diaspora, particularly from the South Asian subcontinent. He's the author of Bengali Harlem and the Lost Histories of South Asian America, and co-editor with Miyabi Chatterjee, Sujani Reddy, and Manu Vimalaseri of The Sun Never Sets: South Asian Migrants in the Age of U.S. Power. His films include Taxiwala/Autobiography, which explored the lives, struggles, and activism of New York City taxi drivers from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and Mutiny, Asians Storm British Music, a music documentary, social documentary, about South Asian youth, music, and anti-racist politics in 1970s to 1990s Britain. Bald is currently working on a transmedia project aimed at recovering the histories of peddlers and steamship workers from British colonial India who came to the United States under the shadows of anti-Asian immigration laws and settled within US communities of color in the early 20th century. The project consists of the Bengali Harlem book, as well as documentary film, In Search of Bengali Harlem, currently in production, and a digital oral history website, which is currently in development. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Vivek.
Thank you so much, Joy, and thank you, Nisha and Victoria, for inviting me and organizing this event. I'm going to be reading some passages from the book, from Bengali Harlem, and as some of you know, it was originally published in 2013 and then in paperback in 2015. I will start just by telling you just a little bit of background about this project. It really started as a documentary film project when in the late 1990s I started to get to know my now collaborator Alauddin Ullah, who is a comedian, actor, and playwright from Harlem. And when we met around 1998, 99, he wanted to make a documentary about his father. And when he told me about his father, it was just really striking to hear his story. His father, Habib, had come to the United States in the 1920s. Alauddin told me, and had settled in Harlem and married a Puerto Rican woman, Victoria Echevarria, and then essentially lived his entire adult life in Spanish Harlem from the 1920s until his death in the early 1980s. At that point, Alauddin was only 14 years old, and his father had remarried to Alauddin's mother, who was much younger and had come from rural, what was then West Pakistan, or East Pakistan, and then soon to become Bangladesh. So when Aladdin told me this story, it just immediately raised questions for me, because the history that I was familiar with in terms of South Asian migration to the United States really focused on migration to the West Coast, Punjabi migration through the Pacific Northwest and into California, the history of the Ghadar Party, and histories of intermarriage between South Asian, Punjabi men and Mexican American and Mexican women in California and the Southwest. And there was sort of an assumption that South Asian American history kind of stopped around 1917 when a very strict anti-Asian immigration law was passed. That law wasn't fully repealed until 1965, but when it was repealed in 1965, the new law was written in a way that favored professionals, engineers, doctors, etc. And so when the first really large wave of migration came after 1965, it was very much that kind of background. But in between 1917 and 1965, there was this assumption that nothing was happening, that the doors had closed. And so when Aladdin told me about his father's story, it really piqued my interest, and we decided to do a documentary. But when I started to just look around to find out what kind of existing historical work might have been written that Aladdin's father was part of, there was nothing. So it eventually directed me into a PhD program in order to do the historical work for the documentary. But then, of course, the historical work that I did ended up first being published in this book. So I'm going to read a few different passages. The research that I did turned up two distinct earlier migrations that both involved Muslim men from Bengal. The first was a group of silk peddlers who came from an area just north of Calcutta in the Hooghly district, which is still part of West Bengal in India. And then the other group that started coming later were ship workers coming out of the port of Calcutta, but originally from villages in areas that are now Bangladesh. So I'm going to read you a few different passages, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. All right, so here we go. I'm also going to share this screen. All right. Ellis Island was on fire. The grand 3-story immigration station had cost more than $75,000 and had taken almost 2 years to build. It had been in operation for no more than 5.5 years, and now, in the middle of the night of June 15th, 1897, a fire had broken out. More than 200 immigrant detainees were rushed out of the building as the flames spread. Across the water on the southern tip of Manhattan, fire crews scrambled into action, but before their boats could reach the island, the entire pine structure was engulfed in smoke and fire. The ceiling quickly caved in, and the federal government's flagship immigrant processing station collapsed to the ground. 3 days later, the SS St. Louis sailed into New York Harbor from Southampton, England. It was a beautiful early summer evening. The sky was clear and the weather was warm. The St. Louis approached the Statue of Liberty, still a relatively new addition to the waters below Manhattan, and turned gently to the left toward the mouth of the North River, now known as the Hudson. 12 Muslim men from Calcutta and Hooghly, West Bengal, were on board the steamship, preparing to disembark after their 6-day journey across the Atlantic. Ahead and to the ship's right, they would have seen southern Manhattan's impressive outcrop of skyscrapers, the tallest reaching more than 20 stories above the ground, aglow in the evening sun. On their left, where their ship was supposed to dock, lay a pile of rubble. Since the conflagration, the Bureau of Immigration had been scrambling to deal with incoming passenger ships. Each day, 2 or 3 more ships arrived, bearing thousands of immigrants from Europe and points farther east. In the absence of a processing facility, the Bureau had ordered arriving steamships to proceed to their respective piers along the Manhattan waterfront. A team of medical and immigration inspectors would meet each ship as it docked, examine its passengers, and admit or detain them as warranted. So after passing the embers of Ellis Island, the St. Louis made its way up the North River to Pier 14, the terminal for its parent company, the American Line. This was one of the largest and most modern structures on the waterfront, extending into the river from West Street between Fulton and Vesey, exactly where, a century later, the North Tower of the World Trade Center would stand. The Bengali men on board the St. Louis were peddlers on their way to the beach resorts of New Jersey, Atlantic City, Asbury Park, and Long Branch. In their home villages, their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters produced finely embroidered silk and cotton fabrics, handkerchiefs, bedspreads, pillow covers, and tablecloths in a style known as chikun. No doubt the luggage that each man carried was filled with such goods. At some point earlier in the year, perhaps as recently as May, the 12 men had made their way by ship from Calcutta to Southampton, England. They had then crossed the Atlantic in the SS St. Louis with more than 200 other migrants, immigrants, and travelers. They shared the cramped quarters of third class with a German butcher, an Armenian student, a Japanese cook, 2 Russian Jewish tailors, and a number of returning Americans, a dressmaker, a cigar worker, a cattleman, and a upholsterer. More than half the passengers were Scandinavian immigrants on their way to New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Minnesota, and North Dakota. The majority of these men and women were farmers, laborers, and domestic workers. What were the Bengali peddlers anticipating as their ship docked on West Street? The older members of the group, Mintos Mondo, Moksad Ali, and Musha Mondo, had been making voyages to the United States since the 1880s. In those early years, they had been through immigration procedures at Manhattan's Castle Garden Depot, and they may have seen the Ellis Island station under construction, sailing past it on their way in and out of port. In more recent years, a few of the peddlers had passed through Ellis Island's imposing new processing facility and made their way through its maze of metal pens, going from one type of inspection to the next. It is hard to know whether these previous experiences would have eased the Bengalis' anxiety as they approached Pier 14 or increased it. The men likely knew what to expect as they faced the indignity of the medical exam, in which they were poked and prodded like cattle, their hair combed through for lice, their eyelids pulled back with a metal hook to check for trachoma. However, the number of questions that the immigration examiners asked them had been increasing, and the speed at which they were asked these questions had grown more rapid. And in the days following the Ellis Island fire, the examiners were, no doubt, under pressure to be extra vigilant, to prove that the adverse conditions would not hamper their ability to prevent undesirable aliens from entering the country. When Mintos and Musa Mondo, Moksad Ali, their colleagues Abdul Aziz, Abdul Ahmed, Basiruddin, Obidullah, and Fazle Rahman, and the rest of their group went up before the examiner, They gave a single set of answers to a quick succession of questions. Occupation, merchant. Nationality, East Indian. Last residence, Southampton. Final destination, New Jersey. Who paid for your ticket? Myself. How much money do you have with you? £6. Been in the United States before? Yes. Joining a relative? No. Been in prison? No. Polygamist? No. Under contract to work in the United States? To this last question, they all answered no. Or at least this is what was recorded on the incoming ship's manifest. But something must have happened when the men were face to face with the immigration examiner. Something was said, something was misunderstood, someone hesitated, or the examiner simply decided that the dozen Indians were suspicious, that they looked like contract workers entering the country in violation of the law. He ordered them detained. As the Scandinavian farmers and workers disembarked onto West Street to start new lives, meet eagerly waiting relatives, or make their way to points farther west, the 12 Muslim peddlers from Bengal were taken away to the southern tip of Manhattan, to a makeshift detention center on the top floor of the barge office, a facility that one contemporary reporter described as, quote, grimy, gloomy, and more suggestive of an enclosure for animals than a receiving station for prospective citizens. Across the water, a few miles down the New Jersey coast, the beach boardwalks were filling up with thousands of summer vacationers, thousands of potential customers for the fancy goods that sat packed away in the peddlers' trunks. But this summer's trip was not to be. After holding them in detention for 8 days, the Bureau of Immigration's Board of Special Inquiry ordered the 12 men deported, declaring that, quote, inasmuch as they peddle goods not their own, they are held to come under provisions of the contract labor law, end quote. On the ship that took them back to London, the men were now listed as laborers rather than merchants. What is remarkable about this story is not the harshness of the treatment to which the 12 Bengali peddlers were subjected, or the cursory nature of the Board of Inquiry hearing that turned them back from U.S. shores. In the closing years of the 19th century, as the number of immigrants arriving at U.S. ports swelled, the federal government had taken over the processing and evaluation of arriving passengers, a role previously played by individual states. The government's Immigration Bureau began rationalizing, regularizing, and tightening the criteria according to which alien passengers could be admitted. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Alien Contract Labor Law of 1885 were two of the first elements of the new border regime. Both were suffused with racist assumptions about the nature of Asian laborers, and both complicated the Bengali peddlers' ability to cross into the United States, making their treatment in 1897, at the very least, unsurprising. What was remarkable was that the peddlers' ability to adapt to their deportation and operate within a much larger field of possibilities. Within a month of their arrival in London, 5 of the deported men, Musa Mondo, Basiruddin, Abdul Aziz, Abdul Ahmed, and Obidullah, you can just make out here on this slide, signed on with a group of 50 miners from England, Scotland, Ireland, and North and Eastern Europe, and set off by steamer for South Africa, which along with Australia was another market for their goods. Within a year or two, almost all 12 men would return to the United States, traveling in smaller groups, trying different ports, finding a way to get back in, to reunite with kin and co-villagers and carry on their work. These men were part of what may be the first significant settlement of South Asians in the United States. Beginning sometime in the 1880s, Muslim peddlers from a cluster of villages just north of Calcutta began traveling to the United States to sell, quote, Oriental goods, embroidered cotton and silk, small rugs, perfumes, and a range of other items. Indian demand for their handicrafts had declined under colonial rule as the British imported cheap factory-made textiles and established greater control over the subcontinent's internal markets. But overseas, middle-class consumers in Britain, Australia, South Africa, and the United States were in the midst of a fin de siècle fashion for the exotic ideas, entertainments, and goods of India and the East. Other Indian traders had made their way outward from the subcontinent to sell handicrafts to European travelers in the Mediterranean and North Africa. The Bengalis ventured into new territories, establishing an extensive network that stretched through the east coast of the United States and into and across the southern states and as far south as Panama. Even as US laws and attitudes turned against Asian immigrants, these men worked the India craze to their advantage. Between the 1890s and the 1920s, as the policing of immigration shifted from the regime of the Alien Contract Labor Law to that of the explicitly exclusionary Immigration Act of 1917, these men built upon existing ties of kinship and newly established connections within US communities of color to build, maintain, and expand their operations. In their own day, they became a regular fixture at North American tourist sites and on the streets of major US cities, yet they have vanished from historical memory. Okay, I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit now. Lost my place. Hold on one second. So while I'm finding my other bookmark, I'll just say that the men who came as peddlers over the 1880s, 1890s, and into the early 1900s really settled most prominently in New Orleans. And New Orleans, at that time, at the turn of the 20th century, was really remaking itself as a tourist city, as the tourist city that in some respects it remains. But this was when the leaders of New Orleans were consciously turning it into a tourist site, especially for the summer months, for people to come down from the north of the United States, or the winter months, I'm sorry. And in this period of time, I'll read a little bit about the settlement of some of these men within, particularly on the edge of Storyville, which was a sex district, a legalized sex district, and on the other side, the neighborhood of Treme, which is one of the oldest African-American neighborhoods in the United States. Okay. Between 1900 and 1910, a group of these network veterans, Solomon Mundell, Abdulaziz Taslimuddin, Abdul Ghaffar Mandel, Abdul Majid, followed Storyville's displaced working class population into the blocks of houses just outside the borders of the sex district. The peddlers crowded into the homes here. This is actually one of the addresses, census record from one of the addresses that became a kind of boarding house for these men. The peddlers crowded into the homes here. Between 4 and a dozen men lived together at each address in simple spaces that were rarely larger than 800 square feet. Although they spread out across the city to sell their goods each day, here in these houses, they shared the domestic and intimate aspects of their lives, cooking and eating together, washing and cleaning, likely sharing beds, caring for those who fell ill, helping each other navigate the challenges of their daily lives, and spending leisure time with one another. In one of the few accounts that exists from this era of the Bengali peddlers at rest, a visiting Indian student wrote that, quote, "Here in the South, they live in groups, and you often notice them in their pajamas sitting at ease, playing cards and gossiping, mostly about old-fashioned things," unquote. It is not clear how much these men interacted with the others around them, but there was a tenor of daily experience that they would have all shared with one another. The character and landscape of the neighborhood were similar to those of St. Louis Street before the creation of Storyville. The Bengalis' neighbors were predominantly of color, classified on census enumerations as Black and mulatto, and the buildings around them included many multi-generational extended family households that were often female-led. These neighbors included washerwomen, porters, riverboat and ocean-bound sailors, railroad and levee workers, and a wine rectifier and a barber. The streets were still unpaved, and the houses were packed closely together, long one-story shotgun homes made of wood and tin, a door every 10 feet. When it rained hard, the streets here would have run with mud and sewage. When New Orleans experienced its frequent outbreaks of diseases such as tuberculosis, smallpox, and yellow fever, they spread fastest in overcrowded areas like this. And the results are evident in the death certificates of those who died here in the opening years of the century, including the handful of Bengalis who passed during these years. Jainal Abdin, dead at 35 in 1900. Bahadur Ali, dead at 42 in 1906. Muqsad Ali, dead at 46 in 1918, all from tuberculosis. In addition to these conditions, most of the men from Bengal shared with their neighbors a set of social constraints, varying levels of literacy and education, marginal economic status, and dark skin, which relegated them to some of the most neglected housing in the city. Of the group of Bengali residences that appeared on the federal census in 1910, 2 stood out from the rest, as they were farther from the edge of the sex district and several blocks deeper into the center of Treme. Significantly, these were the homes of 2 of the Bengali men who had married local women of color. Joseph Abdin was living with his wife, Viola, an African-American woman from Mississippi, 4 blocks east of the district on Orleans Avenue. They had a household of 10 that included Joseph and Viola's 2 children, and Viola's mother, sister, 3 nephews, and niece. Sofar Ali was living with his wife, America, a New Orleanian of Creole and Cuban descent, and their 3 children, a few blocks farther up Orleans Avenue, near the corner of North D'Urbigny. Both of these men were near commercial areas that catered not to white tourists, but to the predominantly Black working-class residents of the neighborhood. Abdin's residence faced the covered Treme market, and Ali's was 1 block away from the emerging, quote, Negro shopping and entertainment district on North Claiborne Avenue. In 1910, Abdin and Ali were at the front edge of a shift that New Orleans Bengali peddlers would make over the next decade and into the 1920s, as anti-Asian immigration laws made the crossing of U.S. borders more difficult for the peddlers, and as New Orleans commercial segregation became more stark. So this is those who remained in New Orleans opened up shops along North Claiborne Avenue, which many years later was, like many of these neighborhoods, was destroyed by a freeway project. to bring people from the outer suburbs into the middle of the city. Okay, now I'm going to skip forward. Let me just check on the time here. I'm going to skip forward to the stories of the ship workers. So this is a story that really begins more in the 1910s. So roughly at the time that the peddler network was dwindling, more and more men who worked on British steamships were entering US ports. On a Sunday morning at the end of December 1907, a time of year when Hooghly's peddlers were selling their wares far from the cold Northeast, a different set of Indian Muslim men appeared on the waters of New York Harbor. Several small groups set out in rowboats from piers all over the area, from the east side and west side docks of Manhattan, and from the waterfronts of Brooklyn, Staten Island, and New Jersey. In the brisk winter morning air, the men rowed south and eastward across New York's crowded, choppy waterways, weaving past freighters, tramps, schooners, and ferries toward bush docks in South Brooklyn. There at the edge of the neighborhood now known as Sunset Park, they climbed onto the upper deck of a German steamship, the Stolzenfels, where they prepared to mark 23 Dhul Qida, the martyrdom of Ali Raza, the eighth Imam of Shia Islam. These men were sailors, or more precisely, maritime laborers. They were stokers, firemen, coal trimmers, and stewards from various steamships that were then in port. Over the course of the day, groups of these seamen, lascars as the British called them, kept turning up in one small boat after another. By the time of the ceremony and feast, 50 Indian Muslim men had arrived from every part of the New York waterfront and were gathered on the deck of the Stolzenfels, a crowd that included the ship's European officers, a press photographer, and a New York Times reporter stood at a distance to watch. The reporter's story appeared prominently on page 3 of the Times the next morning. His narration of the sailors' activities was a mixture of fantasy, newspeak, and condescension. For hours before the beginning of the feast, the Times reporter wrote, little Lascar sailors came. The South Brooklyn Pier at the foot of 42nd Street was the Mecca toward which all the Lascars headed. The little brown sailors squatted on the forward deck of the German freighter, and the sheep's head was pointed to the sun. It was then massaged by one of the Lascars until those who viewed the ceremony from the bridge felt sure that the sheep was hypnotized. Quick as a wink, the animal was dispatched, and before any of the flesh was touched, every drop of blood in the animal had been allowed to trickle into a pan on the deck. Nor was a knife used in skinning the animal. The Lascar butcher did that with his thumb so skillfully and in such a short time that a stockyard butcher could not have beaten him. While this was going on, the band played the sacred music incidental to the Feast of the Mala. The music sounded to American ears much like that heard at a Coney Island sideshow. End quote. This was just one of a number of stories that appeared in US newspapers at the turn of the 20th century, describing the arrival of strange and curious Hindu sailors in port cities along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. And here the word Hindu is often spelled with 2 O's and is really more of a racial category that was used to describe everyone from India. Writing from the marginal spaces of the United States docklands and waterfronts in New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Galveston, reporters ushered Lascars onto the terrain of the US popular imagination. Here are some of the images. To American readers at the turn of the century, Indian seamen might as well have been fictional characters. Judging by the press reports of the day, they were equal parts exotic and peculiar, inscrutable and fanatical, ridiculous and treacherous. At the same time, These articles offer us a glimpse into the lives that this population of workers from the subcontinent were fashioning for themselves as they spent days, weeks, and months in US ports, waiting for their ships to unload, reload, and set back out to sea. Most poignant are the accounts of Indian seamen who were faced with burying comrades who had died during their ship's voyages. Even the most voyeuristic descriptions of these moments hint at the care that the seamen took to prepare their co-workers' bodies in accordance with Muslim practice and to maintain the privacy and dignity of burial rites in unfamiliar and unsympathetic surroundings. When a Galveston newsman reported on a funeral that visiting Indian seamen held for a member of their crew, he recounted a set of deliberate steps these men took to guard and prepare their friend's body and ensure his proper placement in a grave facing Mecca. Another account focusing on the death of an Indian steamship cook described a, quote, weird ceremony, unquote, at New York's Bellevue Hospital in which, quote, each of the friends of the deceased removed his shoes and stockings and taking a pail of water, sat down on the curb outside the morgue door and bathed his feet, unquote. Even the New York Times 1907 account of the, quote, Feast of the Mala, with its demeaning descriptions of little brown men performing like a Coney Island sideshow, revealed that Indian seamen were organized and determined enough to secure the use of the upper deck of the Stolzenfels for their observances, and then to communicate and coordinate among Muslim crew members on multiple ships spread across several miles of New York waterfront. So I'm going to skip ahead now. So this pattern of jumping ship, which started in the 1910s, continued and grew over the course of the next couple of decades. And over time, the same sort of spirit that you see here of determinedly making lives, even in a situation where after 1917, every single one of these men had been rendered so-called illegal and was living under what we would now call the shadows of the immigration laws. That what was striking in all of this research is how much these men and the women and others who they connected with on shore were able to craft lives within these unencouraging settings. So now I'm talking about the 1930s and New York City. By now, an increasing number of Indian Muslim ex-seamen were marrying within local communities of color. While roughly half the Indian population uptown in the 1930s were single men living as boarders or in small group households, 1/3 had married and were living with their Puerto Rican, African American, or West Indian spouses. The records of these unions are scattered. This is a map showing different points throughout Harlem where ex-ship workers had settled. The records of these unions are scattered among the thousands of New York City marriage certificates issued from the early 1920s through the late 1930s. The majority of men listed in these records were in their 20s when they got married. They were either working in restaurants or doing other kinds of manual or semi-skilled labor, ranging from silk dyeing to automobile repair. Many listed Calcutta or Bengal rather than simply East India as their place of birth. The women they married were primarily in their late teens and early 20s and were either African American women from various parts of the United States, New York, Baltimore, Jacksonville, Carlisle, South Carolina, or women from Puerto Rico, San Juan, Vega Baja, Santurce, and in one case, the Dominican Republic. While the African American women in these records were consistently listed as colored or Negro, and the Puerto Rican women were in most instances classified as white, the Indian grooms seemed to confound the city marriage clerk's understanding of race. when it came to color, these men were classified in every possible way: white, colored, Negro, Indian, and East Indian. The mixed marriages did not go unnoticed in Harlem's local press. In the late 1920s, unions between Indian men and African American and Puerto Rican women began to appear in the pages of the neighborhood's most prominent Black periodical, the New York Amsterdam News. Initially, these were simply entries among the newspaper's lists of the neighborhood's marriage certificate issues. In June 1927, for example, the issue of licenses to Mokad Ali of 2971 West 36th Street and Miss Mabel Leola Gibson of 36 West 128th Street, as well as to Abdul Karim, 322 West 141st Street, and Miss Mildred Hayes, 242 West 146th Street, were among a list of 55 recent issues of marriage certificates. In 1932, a similar certificate issue warranted its own short paragraph. Under the headline, "To Wed East Indian," the Amsterdam News wrote, "Monsieur Mia, 27, who said that he was born in Bombay, India, has obtained a license to wed Miss Lillian Pons, a domestic of 1926 2nd Avenue. Mia lives at 301 West 102nd Street." End quote. By 1935, the news reported at greater length not merely on the issue of a marriage license, but also on the private reception following an Indian African-American wedding. Both the content and the tone of the article, familiar and matter-of-fact, suggest that such occurrences were gradually becoming a normal part of the social life of Harlem. Quote, "The many friends of Mr. and Mrs. Saeed Ali Mia, newlyweds, attended a wedding reception in their honor at their home, 260 West 125th Street, last Friday evening. The Mias were married at the 18th Street Methodist Church on April 5th. The Reverend Charles F. Devine officiated. Mrs. Mia, formerly Miss Marguerite Richardson, is the daughter of Harper Richardson of 401 West 149th Street. Her uncle, Charlie Anderson, with whom she made her home, is a well-known dancing teacher with studios at 2323 7th Avenue. Mr. Mia is a native of Bengal, India." End quote. The Amsterdam News did not merely report on the joyous moments of such marriages, however. Its pages suggest that these unions were complicated and that lives on both sides of each marriage could be precarious. On March 1st, 1933, for example, the paper reported on the sentencing of, quote, Kotio Mia, formerly of 267 West 137th Street, to 2.5 to 5 years on charges of bigamy. Quote, "Mia's first wife, Belicia Jimenez," the news wrote, quote, "a South American whom he married in 1927, claimed that he left her in 1932 to marry Carmen Jimenez, a Puerto Rican, without obtaining a divorce. Mia's trial was unique in the annals of General Sessions in that the defendant was convicted, his attorney was fined $25 for contempt of court, and his 6 witnesses, all hailing from India, were arrested by immigration officials for unlawful entry into the country as fast as they left the witness stand." So I'll just read one last page here. And this is from a section of the book towards the end where that's based on interviews with members of the second generation. So in other words, children of Bengali African-American and Bengali Puerto Rican marriages who grew up in the 40s and 50s and are now in their 70s and in some cases 80s. And here on the screen, on the lower left, you can see Habibullah Jr., who is Alauddin's older half-sibling, and Alauddin's father, Habib, there on the upper left. I'll go through a few of these photographs, family photographs as well. Over time, these varied mixed marriages and the families to which they gave rise cohered into a unique New York area community. Although Harlem remained a center of gravity, by the 1950s and 60s, these families were increasingly spread out in different parts of the Bronx, Brooklyn, Long Island, and New Jersey. The Pakistan League of America held two major events each year that brought together its full membership of predominantly Bengali ex-seamen, their Puerto Rican, African American, and Afro-Caribbean wives, and all these couples' children. One of these events was the yearly celebration of Eid, the breaking of the fast at the end of the month of Ramadan. The League held a yearly Eid celebration from its inception in 1947, initially gathering at the Bengal Garden restaurant or at the League's clubhouse on the Lower East Side, and then, as these events got larger, in a series of banquet halls in the Midtown hotels where its members were employed as kitchen workers and doormen. By the 1950s and 60s, the Pakistan League's Eid celebrations brought out hundreds of people. In the early days, when I was younger, remembers Ibrahim Chowdhury's son Noor, quote, we'd go to the Eids and there'd have to be 300 or 400 people, maybe even more. The men would get there earlier and they'd do a lot of praying, and it seemed like there were at least 100, 150 men only. After that, it came time to have the big feast, and the women would come. So then it was wall-to-wall people. I can remember one time they had 12 rows of tables, and these guys came marching out of the kitchen, had to be 8 or 9 of them with everything, putting it on the table family style, the rice, the bowls of chicken, everything. If you went home hungry, it was your own fault. Eid was always a great celebration. It was a time when everybody was joyful. So I'll stop there, and I'll stop sharing so that we can go to questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Vivek. This was incredibly interesting. I know some of us are chatting over Slack, and I'm even texting my parents, and we're having multiple side chats over the details that you've presented, and I'm particularly excited to rewatch the recording and get another look at some of the images that you shared. I will start with the first question that we received. This was sent over registration by one of the attendees, and the question is about the book turning into a film. So could you talk a little bit more about that and give us an idea of when to look out for that production?
Sure. Yeah. So as I mentioned, this whole project started as a film, or an idea for a film, and we started doing some filming early on in the early 2000s. But it wasn't really until after the book was published that I was able to reconnect with Alauddin, and the two of us together start working on the film again. So between 2013 and now, we've been essentially shooting, and now in the last year and a half editing the film. The film, we've what's called locked picture back in like March. That means that the edit is done, and at this point we're doing various stages of the kind of polishing work that goes on in post-production, like a sound edit and color correction and various other kinds of things. So we're applying to festivals. With any luck, we'll get into one of those festivals and premiere the film in the fall. And if not then early in the next year.
Okay, thank you for that. I will surely be on the lookout, as I'm sure are many other people on this Zoom. So we did just get another question. Was there any interactions with the Punjabi Mexican community in California within the Bengali community, or was there any awareness in between the two?
That's a really good question that I haven't come across any indication of that. I think that because those populations, once they settled in those two parts of the country, pretty much stayed within those communities. And also what's different about the community in New Orleans is that by the second and third generation in New Orleans, really the children and the grandchildren were part of the African-American community in Treme. And there was no further migration, whereas in California and the Southwest, there was renewed migration of Punjabis to the West Coast, and then and also a Gurdwara that had been formed there, and so there was much more of an infrastructure on the West Coast, and so that it remained as a community that had roots in Punjabi migration. But I have the only folks who might have actually gotten a sense of both there were certain students who were traveling to different parts of the country who were involved in a nationalist publication called the Hindustani Student that was sort of meant to educate the people in the United States about the independence struggle in India. And one of the only firsthand accounts of someone outside the community describing the community in New Orleans came from a student who was part of that group who traveled to New Orleans and met with members of the community there. So it may be that there was some awareness that both of these sort of sets of intermarriages and multiracial communities existed, but I haven't found any evidence of them being aware of one another.
Okay, thank you for that very detailed answer. You did mention the Gurdwara being set up on the West Coast, and we did have another question related to religiosity, and that one is, in Bengali Harlem, or even within the community in New Orleans, did they have the ability to pray in a specific place, or was that kind of kept underground?
Over time, I mean, I have more of a sense of Harlem than of New Orleans. In New Orleans, I've only heard stories from descendants who describe certain kinds of cultural and religious practices that were retained for the first generation or two and then dissipated. And in those cases, actually, with this one particular family of Muqsad Ali and Ella Blackman, who were featured on the Asian Americans documentary, which if you haven't seen, I highly recommend. They, in their family, over the course of the generations, they lost touch with really a sense of even where Muqsad Ali had come from. They knew that he was Muslim, but the family by that point was Catholic. You know, there's a very strong Black Catholic tradition in New Orleans, but the way that things survived over the generations was that they kept using the same names from the first generation down. So the first 8 children of Muqsad Ali and Ella Blackman Ali had Bengali Muslim names, first names, and those names were repeated and continued to the present in 5th and 6th generations, children in that particular family line. In terms of New York, the kind of religiosity or religious practice really varied a lot from family to family, depending on the father, the Bengali Muslim father. Some of those fathers, like Aladdin's father, kind of, he held to dietary restrictions and he celebrated Eid, but he wasn't as he didn't practice as say fully and regularly in terms of daily practice, daily prayers, etc., as some of the other men, and wanted his children to quote unquote become American. And what that meant really was become part of their block and their neighborhood, which was really becoming Puerto Rican American. But that's, so that Habib Jr., for example, spoke as much Spanish or maybe more Spanish than he spoke Bangla. But in terms of some of the other men, Ibrahim Chowdhury, who I mentioned briefly here, who was one of the founders of the Pakistan League of America. It was called the Pakistan League from 1947 to 1971 because even though the majority of members were from what was then East Pakistan, but Ibrahim Chowdhury was very much someone who played the role of an imam within the community and did that within households, within smaller settings, whatever settings they could, but also was leading an effort to build a mosque for many, many years. So they were raising money among the community and among the larger Harlem community. They would have dances where they would sell tickets to come to these dances in Spanish Harlem, where the music, by all accounts, was actually, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Afro-Latinx music. And the men would stay up all night, the Bengali men would stay up all night making sandwiches beforehand, and they would sell those sandwiches to make more money on top of the tickets. So all of this over time was going to save up money to actually create a mosque. And eventually that mosque was built on what was then the Lower East Side, now the East Village, and it's still there. It's the East 10th Street Mosque, East 10th and First Avenue. But also by that time there were mosques, African-American Muslim mosques throughout Harlem that were starting up. So, so there were some men who went to those mosques, and so yeah, it was sort of, as a lot of the what I sort of refer to as life making, it was really improvisational and doing the most with whatever they had at any particular time and striving for more.
Okay, thank you once again for that really detailed answer. I just have been listening to a lot of music and watching a few films that are, even to this day, showcasing some of the melding of the culture, especially within New York City. So I just got really excited and jealous of the people that got to experience Bengali food and Spanish music at the same time. But I want to be mindful of time. We do have a couple more questions. Are you okay if we just do one more?
Sure. There's a couple waiting.
Okay, cool. So one of them are the descendants, do you know if any of the descendants have any contact with Bengali culture or the broader South Asian Indian diaspora, or even the Pakistani diaspora, depending on later trends of migration?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, it's in some ways that has depended upon kind of continuing connections to migration after 1965 and after 1971, after the Liberation War. And so, for example, I've been hearing more and more from Bangladeshi American families in the New York area who came here in the early 70s or even late 60s, and have been here since then. And the first people that they connected with here were, there was an uncle who was already here who had married an African American woman or a Puerto Rican woman, right? And so there are definitely, within some families, I've seen the families, the extended families that came after 1965 that remain in touch with and connected to family members from before 65. So that is definitely something that has happened within some families. And in other cases, members of the second generation and down, have become interested in traveling back to the places where their ancestors were from, and in Aladdin's case, he came to sort of a point in time while we were working in the film where he felt like he needed to do that, to answer certain questions that no one here could answer for him. And so he had only been back to his own village, his parents' village, when he was 8 years old, and so then he went back, in his 40s. Yeah, I mean, I think the other story that I've been hearing, the other kind of story is the second generation who grew up in Harlem or the Lower East Side, who are mixed, connecting with the book as a way of proving to their children and grandchildren that this actually happened. This is a story that I've heard from a couple of people. And so, my hope is that the book and the film will continue that process of sort of, bringing people together that, that have in many ways otherwise kind of scattered to the winds.
Okay, I think with that answer and your hope and wish for the book, we will turn it over to Victoria for closing, but I just wanted to say thank you again. And over to Victoria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. And thank you, Vivek, so much. Oh, I have hair in my face. This was fantastic. I know I told you earlier, I know you gave a presentation back in 2013 when the book first came out, and I wasn't able to attend it then. So I was so excited for this opportunity today. So thank you again so much for giving us your time today. And for celebrating Immigrant Heritage Month with us, which is why we wanted to talk with you today. So this was a lovely way for us to close out June. For everybody watching, you can find copies of Bengali Harlem at indiebound.org, and the link will be dropped in the chat shortly. As a reminder, as Nisha had said earlier, we are recording today's event, so it will be up on YouTube shortly. For anybody that missed it, please feel free to send around to anybody else that wants to watch it. As always, you can follow us on all of the socials. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and even LinkedIn. Hashtag is WeAreDFP if you wanted to follow tonight's conversation. And again, we are a volunteer-run organization. We can only do this with your support. So if you are able and willing, please visit desisforprogress.org to throw us a little bit of a donation. And there will be a follow-up email with summarizing what happened today. So thank you, everybody, for your engagement and your time this evening. And again, thank you, Vivek. So everybody have a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.